A dastardly piece of propaganda. Well written, however.
The other thing that I noticed about this, Kevin, I think, that is based on a very fundamental confusion, is that it doesn't distinguish between the moral law in the Old Testament and the ritual law in the Old Testament. Certain things in the Old Testament are prohibited as unclean to the people of Israel. There are certain foods like pork and lobster and other sorts of foods that were ritually unclean. Similarly, other actions would make you ritually unclean. If a woman is during her menstrual period, she is ritually unclean and would need to go through that period and then bathe before she could enter into the temple. There were all sorts of things that if you touched a dead body, for example, you were ritually unclean. But these had nothing to do with the moral law. People who were ritually unclean were not thought to be sinful. A woman during her menstrual period isn't sinning. Someone who has had to participate in burying a corpse isn't a sinful person because he's buried a family member. It is purely a ritual uncleanness, a kind of ceremonial uncleanness that has no moral dimension to it at all. And so what this passage does, or this clip does, is that it confuses the moral law of the Old Testament with certain things in the ritual laws of clean and unclean, and tries to make the moral law against homosexual behavior look trivial by comparing it to this ceremonial law. And that's just mixing apples and oranges. The prohibition against homosexual behavior, like the prohibition against murder and adultery and theft and so forth, that's part of the moral law of God that is valid for all time. But there are all sorts of other aspects of the Old Testament that are merely transitory, temporary, ritual law, like the difference between clean and unclean, which is no longer observed today and which Jesus, in fact, did away with. So you cannot impugn the moral law of God by comparing it to certain aspects of Old Testament ritual law about what is ceremonially clean and unclean, which does indeed sound very, very strange to modern ears.
But that's exactly what this episode does, exactly what this clip does. He puts her in her place, with her own scriptures and so on.
Right, and talking about how the Washington Redskins are going to be having problems by touching the football and things of that sort, which is, again, that's just silly, because that is a reflection of this Old Testament ritual law that had nothing to do with sin or evil or morality whatsoever, in a way that the prohibition against homosexual behavior did.
Can we as Christians further say that the New Testament also condemns homosexual behavior, so it affirms that moral aspect?
Yes, that's what's significant. When Jesus came, he did away with these ritual laws about ceremonial cleanness and uncleanness. Jesus said what goes into a man isn't what defiles a man. It's what comes out of a man, what comes out of his heart, that defiles a man. Evil thoughts, jealousy, lust, murder, and so forth. These come out of the heart. These are what render a man defiled. And so Jesus abolished the distinction, the ceremonial distinctions between clean and unclean that are observed by Orthodox Jews still today, but which Christians don't observe. But the New Testament reaffirms the moral law of the Old Testament. For example, the Ten Commandments, which would include any kind of sexual behavior outside of marriage. It would homosexual activity would fall under the prohibition of any kind of adultery, any kind of extramarital sexual intimate contact. So the New Testament does reaffirm these Old Testament prohibitions against homosexual behavior on the part of anybody, whether homosexual or heterosexual.
By the way, we've done a podcast on the issue of homosexuality and the Christian, And I want to encourage people to go to that podcast because we deal with many of the issues that come up when we discuss this, and that is, well, can I have the proclivity? Does that mean I have to act on it? Can I live a chaste life even though I have homosexual desires? I didn't ask for these desires. Can I be a follower of Christ as a single person, and so on? So we do deal with this whole issue.
That's right. And it's important for folks who are listening who are struggling with these desires to realize that simply in virtue of having these desires doesn't make them sinful. Rather, it's what you do with them. And a person who lives a pure and chaste life before God is honoring God, whether he's heterosexual or homosexual in orientation. All of us are called to be chaste and to keep our thought life and our physical life pure and holy before God.
Bill, as we wrap up today, it seems to me that not only do the secularists get it wrong here in this West Wing episode, but we in the church often get it wrong because we use the same language. We tend to say homosexuality is an abomination. Now, what the church means by that, what most Christians mean by that, is that the behavior is wrong, but they don't make that distinction. Therefore, they put a person who struggles with homosexual feelings, desires, proclivities into a state of hopelessness.
And condemnation, which is just wrong. A person who's leading a chaste life and has this orientation under the control of the Holy Spirit is a brother or sister that we should welcome and not condemn. And so these kind of blanket condemnations, such as are exhibited in this West Wing episode, are really quite unbiblical and sub-Christian.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, for spending some time with us, and thank you, the listener, for being here today. This podcast is available at reasonablefaith.org, as well as a wealth of audio, video, and written materials from William Lane Craig. People all over the world have benefited from the insights of Dr. Craig, and we invite you to browse our resources at reasonablefaith.org. And when you give to Reasonable Faith or purchase our resources, you help us expand into more media and speaking events, taking Christ to a world of big questions. So be sure and visit us at reasonablefaith.org. I'm Kevin Harris. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Reasonable Faith with William Lane Craig.